Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into one of the most famous, most captivating legends of all time, the lost city of Atlantis. You know the one, a magnificent civilization, super advanced tech, and then, bam, a catastrophe that just swallows it whole. But here's the twist. The story of Atlantis is really a story about a story, and that's exactly what we're going to unravel right now. So, let's get into it.
I mean, think about it. What if the greatest lost city was never actually meant to be found? What if the reason no one can find it isn't some deep, dark, oceanic mystery, but because it was never a place at all? That's the big question we're tackling today. And the answer, believe it or not, takes us way back. Not to some ancient king or explorer, but to an ancient philosopher.
And the key to this whole mystery, really, is one simple word: allegory. You've probably heard it before, right? An allegory is basically a story that's not really about what it seems to be about. It's using fictional people and places to talk about much bigger, hidden ideas, usually something moral or political. It's a teaching tool, a clever way to make a point without just spelling it out. And as you're about to see, that's exactly what Atlantis was originally designed to be. All right, so where did this whole thing even come from? Well, it wasn't from some dusty old map or a secret Egyptian scroll. Nope. The entire legend of Atlantis starts right here, as a philosophical thought experiment in ancient Athens, cooked up by one of the most famous thinkers in all of history. That's right. The only original sources we have for Atlantis, the only ones, come from the philosopher Plato. Every single movie, every book, every documentary you've ever seen is based on his account from around 360 BC. Now, Plato claimed he got the story from an Athenian statesman named Solon, who supposedly heard it from Egyptian priests. But, well, modern scholars are pretty much all in agreement that this was probably a clever literary trick, a way to make his fictional story sound super authentic and ancient.
See, Plato didn't just write about Atlantis in a vacuum. He created this epic showdown, a tale of two cities. On one side, you've got his version of an ideal, ancient Athens, the perfect society, totally virtuous, the hero of the story. And on the other side, you've got Atlantis, a massive, powerful naval empire that got way too big for its britches, became corrupt, lost its way, and was ultimately swallowed by the sea. So here's the kicker. Atlantis was literally invented to be the ultimate bad guy, just to make Plato's ideal Athens look even more heroic. It was the perfect foil.
Okay, so if it was just a story with a moral, how on earth did it turn into this global treasure hunt? Well, that line between fiction and history started to get blurry almost right away. It's like a seed was planted that would just lie there dormant for over 2,000 years before it finally sprouted.
And you can see this debate starting immediately. I mean, Plato's own star student, the brilliant philosopher Aristotle, he was totally convinced his teacher just made the whole thing up to prove a philosophical point. A useful fiction, he called it. But then you had other followers, like Crantor, who took the story as 100% historical fact. He even wrote a whole commentary on it. And later writers claimed he'd actually seen Egyptian pillars that backed up the story. So right there, in antiquity, you've got the two camps, allegory versus history. And that little seed of belief was planted. So for a long, long time after that, the story of Atlantis just kind of faded. People knew about it, but it was mostly seen as a piece of philosophy, an interesting fable. But then, just look at this timeline. For over 2,000 years, there's basically radio silence. And then boom, 1882, a guy named Ignatius Donnelly drops a book that changes everything. The modern myth is born. And by the 1960s, it's a full-blown cultural phenomenon. So who was this guy? Who is this person who single-handedly dredged up a forgotten philosophical tale and turned it into a global obsession? His name was Ignatius Donnelly, and his vision of Atlantis would basically define every version of the myth we know today. Donnelly didn't just revive Plato's story, he supercharged it. In his book, which was a massive bestseller, he argued Atlantis wasn't just some lost civilization, it was the lost civilization, the original Garden of Eden, the place where humans first became civilized. He claimed it was the source of all the great ancient cultures. We're talking the Egyptians, the Mayans, you name it. They supposedly invented bronze and iron, came up with the alphabet, and were the original home for all of humanity's major races. It was a grand, unified theory for, well, everything. Now, the idea propping all this up was something called hyperdiffusionism. It's a pseudo-archaeological theory that's been totally debunked now. But the idea was that pretty much all major inventions and cultural developments happened in just one advanced ancient place and then spread out across the world from there. For Donnelly, that one magical place was, you guessed it, Atlantis.
It was a neat and tidy, if completely wrong, answer to how all these amazing separate civilizations could exist.
And after Donnelly, the myth just went wild. It started to mutate and get absorbed into all sorts of fringe movements. First, you have the theosophists like Helena Blavatsky, who worked it into their spiritual theories about root races. Then, things took a much darker turn. German occult groups, and later Nazi ideology, latched onto the myth, fantasizing about a Nordic Atlantean master race. And then, in the 20th century, you get the famous American psychic Edgar Cayce, who gave thousands of detailed readings from what he called the Akashic Records, telling people they were reincarnated Atlanteans. This really cemented Atlantis into the New Age and popular consciousness.
So with all these people now completely convinced that Atlantis was a real historical place, well, what do you think happened next? The hunt began. For more than a century now, explorers, amateurs, and dreamers have been scouring the globe looking for actual, physical proof of Plato's lost empire.
One of the most popular and frankly most plausible theories is that Plato's story wasn't entirely from scratch. It might have been inspired by a real-world cataclysm, the gigantic volcanic eruption of Thera, now the beautiful Greek island of Santorini, back around 1600 BC. This explosion absolutely devastated the advanced Minoan civilization on Crete and would have sent massive tsunamis across the Mediterranean. It's totally possible that the memory of this incredible disaster was passed down for 1,000 years and eventually woven into Plato's philosophical tale.
Another really interesting candidate is located in the marshlands of southern Spain. This spot is just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, what the ancients called the Pillars of Hercules, which is exactly where Plato said Atlantis was. Researchers using satellite imagery have found what look like buried concentric rings in the mud, which perfectly matches Plato's description of the city's layout. The theory here is that an ancient city, maybe the legendary Tartessos, was wiped out by a tsunami. But honestly, Santorini and Spain are just the tip of the iceberg. People have proposed dozens and dozens of locations. And what's funny, as you can see here, is that even though Plato specifically said Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean, most of the serious searches, and not so serious ones, have focused on the Mediterranean. People have claimed to have found it everywhere from the Caribbean to Antarctica. The search has really become its own global phenomenon, often completely disconnected from what Plato even wrote.
So, after thousands of years, after all this searching, all these theories, where does that leave us? Let's bring it all back to what we actually know for sure, and maybe ask why this story still has such an incredible grip on our imaginations.
Let's be perfectly clear. In the world of modern science and scholarship, the consensus is unanimous. The story is a fiction. There is absolutely zero credible scientific or archaeological evidence for a giant, lost continent that vanished beneath the waves. For example, our modern understanding of plate tectonics, which is rock-solid science, makes it physically impossible for a continent-sized landmass to just sink into the ocean that recently. The verdict is in. Atlantis was an invention.
And this quote from Julia Annis, a respected professor of philosophy, just hits the nail on the head. She points out that Plato invented Atlantis to make us think about really important stuff: government, corruption, the dangers of power and greed. And as she says, we have missed the point if instead of thinking about these issues, we go off exploring the seabed. We're looking for treasure in the wrong place.
Which brings us to one last really big question. Why are we still so obsessed with finding a physical place that was only ever designed to be a lesson? The story of Atlantis has morphed from a philosophical warning into a literal treasure hunt. But maybe the real treasure was never a city of golden crystal. Maybe the real treasure is the lesson Plato was trying to teach us all those centuries ago. A lesson about pride, about power, and about how even the greatest civilizations can fall. So why are we still searching for a place when the real value has always been in the idea?